All right. Hey. I'm here.
No.
Oh, you took my. There you go. How you doing, Maxine?
Hi there.
Doing all right?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well. Nice to see you.
You too.
There's a lot of people. Are you on it?
Somebody had already had that one up there.
Well, I don't know who put that one up there. That's not the
not
right one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jensen, or Isaac wouldn't be happy if I went that far.
Well, you open it. How many slides is that
Good.
off then?
Hi there.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah.
Throwing me for a loop
How you
there.
feeling?
Pretty good.
Got a puff hair there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, all of us have that.
oh my goodness.
I don't.
So how was New
Add
Orleans?
on it.
Oh,
Or Nolans, as they say.
Yeah, it is
Nolans.
And they even have it N-O-L-A. They even, like online and stuff, they call it N-O-L-A. Yeah, we had a good time.
Good. Oh, hot and humid, I'm sure.
It was, but it rained, you know, and
What?
so, and it was off and on rain, so
Yeah.
we could do things between the rain.
Oh,
And
that's
it cooled-
good.
So it cooled
So it'd cool it down a
gave
little bit.
breeze. And
Yeah.
So we went to the plantation and,
Oh, fun.
and it was, it was humid, but you could feel a little breeze come through as you know, it hits the sweat on you. And
Where'd you go?
New Orleans.
Oh.
My son lives there.
Oh, that's it.
And I haven't been to see him, so it was good to see him.
Well,
Mostly
fun.
that's the best thing.
Is this the
Yes,
right?
exactly.
How are you?
Is this the right
All
one?
right,
that's
how
in
are
there?
you?
No.
Let's see, because you had a revised one.
Yeah.
And I
The
got to
revised
see,
one was supposed to
I
be
got
in
to
there.
pet
Let me
an
see if that's
alligator.
what.
Oh,
Someone already loaded it.
A big one or a little one?
Yeah, the revised one's supposed to be in there.
It's about this
That's
long.
not
Yeah.
You held the mother.
You did
neck.
hold it?
My
You did hold
I did hold her.
Oh,
Yes,
wow.
she was cute.
Mr. Isaac, how you doing?
She's looking
Hey,
at me and
Isaac, how you doing?
I
Doing
go,
well.
hi. Now, alligator.
I said the same thing, Florence.
It was cute.
There it is, revised part two.
No, ma'am.
off what was up, but let's go
Happy
through it this
birthday.
way.
I beat you.
3 days late.
Happy belated.
I haven't heard it yet.
See slide.
Thank you, John.
Kimberly says happy birthday.
Look
Dave.
Oh, there you go.
Verse-
Okay, so Kimberly
Chapter
back.
22, verse 6.
Yeah, I'm seeing
Bet
it.
that Kelly, she did hold out.
I know.
Because I see 17.
No, she's supposed to wait till the 10th.
She's supposed to wait till Monday.
And Diana's birthday and mine and
Verse 23 right there.
she did do it.
That would have been her grandma's birthday.
Hair was worse.
That would have been that baby's grandma's birthday.
I said John had got one on his
I
birthday.
guarantee you, that would have been a special grandkid. Oh, even more so. I got one on my birthday.
One of them made it.
That's it.
And
That's
she
it.
is full right.
Thank you, Travis.
Is
Make sure that works out.
that go?
I don't know what I'm supposed to.
Hit record.
Oh, here you go. You gotta go record. Not record yet.
There it is.
And he said it
Well, it
was
was.
turned
There
out.
it
There it is.
He could get me back.
Now, let's make sure you didn't mess me up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't.
Oh.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, you did. I just want to use that.
All right. We're in Genesis.
You trying to send Isaac out to class here?
Well, you know, I think we're gonna study on it.
Trying
A
to
little
put
bit
him on the spot?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're going to put Isaac on the spot.
And you spelled it right, too.
Yeah, I tried.
Oh, Debbie's back.
Okay, Genesis 22. We're going to begin at verse 5, but I have a couple of questions that was asked last week that I'm going to answer tonight. And we'll get to that in just a moment. In your handout, you're on page 54, and it'd be capital letter F. And actually G is where we'll start in your handout, page 54. Okay? But we'll look at, we'll begin at Genesis 22, verse 6. Donna Hardis will not be here tonight. She had some teeth work today, so she's not feeling very well. And that's the only one I know of. So let's go to our Heavenly Father in prayer. Our most loving Heavenly Father, we thank Thee so much for this day and for the many blessings You've given us. And we thank Thee for Your love and Your patience with each one of us. Your willingness to send Your Son to die upon the cross that we might have everlasting life if we'll be faithful to Thee. We're thankful, Father, that we can come together and study Thy Word without fear of persecution. We're thankful for the encouragement that we bring to each other. And we ask, Father, that You be with us, that we might always give You the praise and the glory and never bring any shame or reproach upon Thee or upon the church. We ask, Father, that You be with our members who have physical ailments, that they might be restored to their health, and we ask that You would use us as instruments to reach out and help them in any way that we can. These things we ask in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen. Oh yeah, my daughter has a migraine headache today, so she had to leave home or work early, so that's why she's not here. All right, so let's answer a couple of questions. First, the question came up last week as to how old Isaac was. And I told you that in my notes I had that he was probably around 25 years of age. And I went back and did a little bit of research on that to come up with a more precise answer. And actually I got a wider answer. But I did copy some stuff from the La Vista Church of Christ, which I thought was a good, of all the stuff I looked at in the commentaries and the internet, I felt that the comments made here by La Vista Church of Christ were some good comments. And the first off, yes, John?
What is the Vista? Whatever you said you got them from.
La Vista.
Yeah.
They're up in Washington State. The congregation, that's just the name of the, like this is Seminole Point Church of Christ, that's La Vista.
Okay, well, you using them for references, so I thought
Yeah.
I might ask where they are. Who
Well,
they are.
yeah, they're.
Why are they referenced?
Well, when you pull up on the internet and you're looking.
Why are they a good reference is what I'm asking.
Well, if you'll let me tell you what they
Okay.
said.
All right.
I said they were as good as anything I found. And they were a little bit more concise. So here's the answer. First off, the Bible doesn't give any specific age. And we know that, okay? But there are events surrounding Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac which gives us some clues as to how old he was. And that's what they're saying here. It says here that most scholars believe that Isaac was in his late teens or early 20s at the time of the offering. So at the time that Isaac was conceived, we're told that Abraham was how old? 99 years old. And Sarah was 90 years old. Okay? Ishmael, if you go to Genesis 17th chapter and verse 1 and also verse 17 and verse 25, Ishmael was 13 years of age. Okay? Ishmael was sent out of Abraham's house at the time as Isaac was weaned, as we looked in Genesis 21st chapter. Now, as we mentioned last week, generally the average age of weaning, and that custom was usually 2 to 5 years of age. All right? The next given event is a covenant between Abraham and Abimelech in chapter 21, but no ages are given to tell us when this occurred. It was sometime after this covenant that Isaac was offered. After the sacrifice of Isaac came news of Abraham's relatives in Haran, and then we are told that Sarah died at the age of what?
127.
127, and that's Genesis chapter 23, verse 1. So the sacrifice of Isaac must have occurred between the ages of 5 and 36, which is quite a broad span. So in addition,
That's safe.
that's safe. In addition, though, you remember we talked about, if you look at 22 verse 5, it says that Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." So you see that word lad there. Sometimes the word lad is referred to as a boy, but it's also referred to as a young man. You also see in verse 12 of Genesis 22, it says, "And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." So both those two verses refer to him as a lad. This noun is used to refer to a male from infancy to young adult, not yet married. For example, Joseph is called a lad at the age of 17 if you went to Genesis the 37th chapter and verse 2. And at the age of 30 in Genesis 41 verse 12 and 46. But there are some further clues as to what might be the age of Isaac. For example, you remember in the first few verses, how far was it that they traveled to Mount Moriah? Or
3 days.
3 days journey. So first off, we know that Isaac was old enough to travel 3 days journey without his mother. All right. Finally, who was it that carried the wood up to Mount Moriah? It was Isaac. Now, Isaac could not have been 5 years of age to carry that much wood up for a sacrifice. All right. So that gives us a little bit more indication that he was no longer a small child. It serves as the main reason that our best guess is that he was at least in his late teens. Don't know that for sure though, but he would had to been big enough to be able to carry the amount of wood that was being carried by that donkey. So probably the most useful clue, look at verse 6, which we haven't looked at verse 6 yet, but look at verse 6. He says, "So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together." Verse 7, "But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, 'My father?' And he said, 'Here am I, my son.' Then he said, 'Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?'" This is kind of significant because as they climb the mountain, Isaac is the one carrying this large pile of wood, enough for the burnt sacrifice. But this fact tells us Isaac wasn't a small child when he was to be sacrificed, and he was at least a healthy teenager. And Isaac's age also adds an interesting dimension to the story. If he was strong enough to carry the wood up the mountain, then he was probably strong enough to resist being sacrificed and fend off his father Abraham, who was an old man at this time. But Isaac allowed his father to bound him and place him on the altar. If you look at verse 9 here, it says, "Then they came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood." Okay, so this shows that Isaac continued to trust his father, okay? Several commentators have weighed in on the question of how old Isaac was when he was to be sacrificed. And some of them, Leopold says he was 18 to 20 years old. Josephus says he was 25 years old. Adam Clark says he was about 33 years old. And Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown say that he was over 20 years of age. The only thing that you can give as a possible clue, other than the fact that he carried the wood up, and the fact that he was able to go 3 days' journey without his mother, was verse 7. And that's where he was asking intelligent questions, because obviously he knew enough about the sacrifice that he is able to ask his father specific questions about the sacrifice, which would suggest that he was somewhere between the age of 13 and probably in his late teens or early 20s. That's the best I can give you on Isaac's age. Any thoughts?
Sounded good.
Sounded good to you? All right. So the other question that came up is, when was Jerusalem established? I found some interesting stuff on Jerusalem. We can go all the way back to Genesis, the 14th chapter. This, of course, was where Melchizedek, king of Salem. Okay. Now, the word Salem means what? Anybody have any idea?
Is it peace?
Peace or
Safe? I don't remember.
righteousness.
Righteousness.
So king of peace, king of righteousness. Now, of course, he was a... we looked at Melchizedek and Christ and everything. Of course, Christ was a king of peace, king of righteousness. Jerusalem, during its long history, had been attacked 52 times and captured and recaptured 44 times. It was besieged 23 times, and Jerusalem was destroyed twice. And the first mention of Jerusalem was probably in Genesis 14, verse 18. That's where Melchizedek was king of Salem. The psalmist also mentions Salem and Jerusalem together, okay? We talked about the fact that there were 3 mounts in the borders of Jerusalem. There is a possibility that this Jerusalem at this time was referring more to the geographical area rather than a specific city. I'm not going to dispute the fact that Jerusalem was in existence at that time. We're told later that Abraham went to Mount Moriah, just north of ancient Jerusalem, to offer his son Isaac, 22, verse 2. The mountain was later incorporated into the city of Jerusalem during the time of Solomon, becoming the Temple Mount. The first mention of the city by the name of Jerusalem is found in Joshua, the 10th chapter, verse 1, where we are told that the city's king, Adoni-Zedek, led a coalition of kings against Joshua and was defeated in the famous battle in the valley of Avalon, when the sun stood still. However, the city of Jerusalem must not have been taken at this time by the Israelites, because after the death of Joshua, we are told in Judges 1, verse 8, that the sons of Judah captured the city, struck it with the edge of the sword, and set it on fire. The age of the city, back in Genesis 14, verse 18, if this indeed is the time that Jerusalem was established and Melchizedek was king of Salem or Jerusalem, this was about 2,000 years before the time of Jesus. So this would suggest that if indeed that is Jerusalem, that it was established about 2,000 years prior to Jesus. Okay, 2,000 years BC. The earth created 4,000 years BC. Okay. That's the best I can give you on that. So I won't say that Jerusalem as a city was there in Genesis 14 verse 18, or if it was the geographical area. But certainly we knew that geographical area existed, and we know that at this point Abraham has been told to take Isaac up to Mount Moriah for a sacrifice. Any thoughts or questions?
Was that, and this is a question, was that Mount Moriah, was that where, I'm not asking the question right. Was that the same mountain that Christ was crucified on?
The suggestion is yes, that it was.
It was not called Moriah, right?
No, there were 3 mounts in the Jerusalem area. Mount Moriah.
And was it Gerizim and no, that's...
Well, Gethsemane.
I have no idea. I've never been there.
Let me go back to my notes here.
I've never been.
I had.
Me neither, but.
I was just curious if that would be the same mountain that he was crucified
Okay.
on. That mountain, maybe we'll do it.
Okay, go to the land of Moriah in verse 22. And Moriah is the mountain on which Solomon built the temple, 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, which has generated the Jewish tradition, still followed by some scholars, that the temple was built on the site where Abraham was to offer Isaac. This is supposed to mean all the mountains of Jerusalem, comprehending Mount Calvary, the Mount of Sion, and Acra. Okay, as Mount Calvary is the highest ground to the west, and the Mount of the temple is the lowest of the mounts. It may have been upon this mount that Abraham offered up Isaac, which is well known to be the same mount on which our blessed Lord was crucified. Yes, John.
Is that Mount 3-day journey from the land of the Philistines?
Well, it's 3 days journey from where they started.
That's not the land of the Philistines, so I guess it is. I mean, they know where the land of the Philistines is.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why I asked, is it a 3-day walk from there?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Must be.
must be, because that's what it says. They journeyed 3 days to get to Mount Moriah. So, any other thoughts? All right. Let's go to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 6. It says, So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. Okay? So Isaac, though called a lad in 22 verse 5, was now a grown man, as we suggested, and was somewhere between, we'll say, 13 to 25 years of age. Okay? And therefore well able to bear that burden. Okay? In this act he was an eminent type of Christ. Remember that Jesus Christ also carried his cross for his crucifixion. All right, so look at verses 7 and 8 now. Karen, you want to read verses 7 and 8 for me, please?
And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together.
All right, so Abraham trusted God as the great provider. Looks like I jumped ahead there a little bit. Isaac knows that they are off to worship, and obviously he's old enough to understand what was required of this worship, this sacrifice. He may also have noticed something weighing on his father's mind at this point. We talked about this last week, whenever the order that Abraham prepared for this journey and everything. Abraham's answer is remarkable that we see here. It is a combination of considerate love and anticipative faith In it, he spares Isaac undue pain and leaves the issue entirely in the hands of God, where in his own heart he left them through the journey. Okay? Now I want to go back and just remind you of it, specifically what God said to Abraham in verse 2. He says, "Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." The reason I wanted to go back here is this is the first time in the Bible that you will actually see the word love. And God was very specific in describing this boy to Abraham. So there was no doubt who God meant in this situation. Any comments through verse 8? All right, look at verses 9 and 10. Kathy, you want to read that for me, please?
Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son.
All right. So in your handout now we're at cap letter I on page 54. So the question is there any command that God has given to us more difficult than the one that he just gave to Abraham?
None.
Can't think of any.
Well, I mean, yes and no, I guess, because I think we're commanded to follow him with our whole heart.
True.
And I don't think that's an easy task. And sometimes we make, we kind of minimize it because, but I think that's a very difficult one. We may not feel as emotionally attached to it as we would our son, but for us to completely surrender everything to him is very difficult.
Well, and I would agree with you, Debbie. But your point also is the fact that here in this case, his only son that he loved, the son of his wife, not only was he doing exactly what you said, complete obedience to God, but now he's being asked to go one step further, to sacrifice his only son, the son that he loves. And that's the only reason I say that might have been more difficult than any command that we have. But I would agree with you, the command to be in complete obedience to him certainly is sometimes a difficult thing for mankind to do, because it requires a lot of sacrifice on our part. Sometimes it may require that we have to give up maybe some close friends, or maybe even not give up relatives, but certainly be very reluctant in how we deal with relatives because of the relationship we have with God. So it's not an easy task, I would agree with you. What we need to appreciate, though, is Abraham completely obeyed God in this situation. And we don't do it necessarily because it sometimes becomes difficult. But notice Isaac's submission here. If he was old enough to carry the wood up the mountain, he would surely be old enough, as we mentioned earlier, to overpower his father, if indeed he was not going to follow God's commandment in this case as well. John?
You know what kind of wood it was?
I don't.
Because, he could carry a whole load of balsa wood, but maybe a couple of sticks of loaf.
Yeah, I would guess. Yeah, and your point's well taken.
There is
But
some light wood that burns extremely hot.
yeah, but does it burn long enough?
It burns hot enough. It don't have to burn long enough. It burns hot enough.
I have no clue what kind of wood it was, and I don't recall seeing anywhere in the commentaries where they even tried to pretend. So
depending upon the type of wood, on his ability to carry, or
Yeah.
inability to carry.
yeah. No, I understand what you're saying there, but I don't have an answer to that question. But here's the thing. Yeah,
It
Isaac.
says something about Isaac for sure. Like, he definitely was Abraham's son.
Well, yeah, he is Abraham's son. It also says that Abraham did an excellent job as a faithful father, bringing up his son and his family in the faith of the Lord. And so in this respect, Isaac represents a clear type of Christ, the only son, taken up a hill, bearing his own cross, to be slain by the Father to please God, while he silently submits, except no one stayed the hand of God when Jesus was killed. And in this case, God stayed Abraham's hand. Once God knew, Abraham's faith was demonstrated here. Any other thoughts or questions on through verse 10?
That was pretty much what I was thinking too, that it shows the trust that Isaac had in his father. He would trust him to the death. He would have.
Yeah.
I really believe he would.
Thank God.
Yeah. Well, remember what we talked about last week too, that because Isaac obviously knew the procedures for the sacrifice, that the sacrificial lamb or whatever it might have been, the animal that they were sacrificing, they laid them on the altar, bound, they cut their throat. Isaac was prepared for that.
That's what his father wanted. I think he might have done it. I'm not sure, but in my mind,
Well, he had the knife raised. It says, then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Verse 10.
that's when he asked,
Yeah.
"Where's?"
Yes, John.
Isaac's been taught about God all this time too.
Yes.
Isaac knows about God.
Right, absolutely.
That he knows that God commanded this. He's not only yielding to his dad, to Abraham. He's yielding to God.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, God spoke to Abraham, but because of the upbringing of Isaac and the faith that he had, he certainly trusted that Abraham was doing God's will, and therefore he was willing to do God's will as well. So, yeah,
And
I would
you
agree with
brought
that.
further on when it's talking about what Isaac did.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. All right, so look at verses 11 and 12. Pat, you want to read that for me, please?
But the angel, or 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad and do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And then Abraham am I supposed to read 13?
No, just through 12.
Okay.
I mean, you could go ahead and read 13, but so obviously we see here that God stayed Abraham's hand. He said, "For now I know that you fear God." And in Abraham's heart, the necessary surrender had indeed been made. He would allow nothing to stand between him and God. His faith shown, God prevents the death of Isaac. And you see that statement, "Now I know"? Now I have what I designed and desire, is basically what God is saying here. Or, "Now I have made thee and others to know," as the Spirit of God and Christ is said to cry, "Abba, Father." Look at Galatians, the 4th chapter, and verse 6. Maxine, you had that?
Galatians 1.
4, verse 6.
And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father.
Okay. And so, go to Romans, the 8th chapter, and verse 15 now. Florence, would you read that for me, please?
For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the Spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father.
All right, so what we see here in Galatians 4:6 and Romans 8:15, it says, "As the Spirit of God in Christ is said to cry, Abba, Father," when it makes us to cry also. Then he goes on to say in verse 12, at the latter part, "Since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." In other words, for my service and sacrifice, or for me, i.e. for my sake, i.e. thou hast preferred mine authority and honor before the life of thy dear son. pointing out Abraham made a choice here. The choice was God. And by which words it appears that God himself speaks these words to Abraham. You made a choice. You made the right choice. You chose me over your son, the son that you love, your only son. Any thoughts through verse 12? All right. Debbie, why don't you read verse 13 and 14 for me, please?
And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided."
All right. So, God will always prove himself to be the provider for all those who fear him, all those who trust him, and all those who do his will. So, names were often attached to places due to the significance of an event that transpired there. And what was the name that Abraham put here?
Or what?
Of this mount.
God will provide.
God will provide. Yeah. In verse 14, the Lord will provide. That was the name that he gave, okay, as Abraham had said to Isaac on the way up. So God, in such a way that clearly displayed his divine providence. Remember what he said back there? He said, Isaac spoke to Abraham in verse 7, "My father," and he said, "Here am my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Notice what Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." And this is what we see in verse 14. Then the provision has been made. The name does not draw any attention to Abraham's role in the story. Thus, his part in the story is not memorialized, rather it is subordinated to that of God. The name highlights only the beneficent actions of God. Okay? Any thoughts through verse 14?
He says, you just read that and it dawned on me. He says, "My son, God will provide for himself."
Uh-huh.
God himself.
Yeah, God is providing for himself, yeah. Yeah. And so, in verse 14, Abraham gave it a name then. The Lord will provide. So, all right. Any other thoughts? All right, look at verses 16 through 18. Ron, you want to read that for me, please?
"And said by myself, I've sworn, says the Lord, because you've done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you. Multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you obeyed my voice."
All right. Now, in your handout, this is page 55, capital letter N, verses 16 through 18. So the blessing of God bestows on Abraham continues due to his obedience to God's commands then. An oath was not necessary to ensure God's faithfulness here, but an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. Look at Hebrews, the 6th chapter, verses 16 and 17. Isaac, you have that?
"For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for the confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundant to the heirs of promise of immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath."
All right. John, I just realized I skipped by you, and I sincerely apologize about that.
Don't think nothing about it.
Well, read Hebrews 6.
Skip me anytime you want to.
No, I don't want to. Look at Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 13. And what we see here in verse 13 is, since God had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. Look at Hebrews 6 verse 13.
For when God made the promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself.
Okay. Now, go back to verses 16 through 18 of chapter 22 here. And he makes this comment here, your descendants, in verse 17. Your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. The gate was the key point in controlling a city. To possess the gate was the equivalent of gaining control of or capturing a city. And Abraham's descendants would be successful in battle with their enemies, is what God is saying to them here. Then he goes on to say, in your seed, in verse 18, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. So the promise was never intended to be restricted to the Jewish people. From the beginning, it had universal appeal. The prophets also clearly and repeatedly speak of the nations entering into God's kingdom. So this idea that it was always designed for the Israelites, the Jewish, God always intended for all men to be saved. Okay? Any comments through verse 18? Yes?
I'm just curious why all their cities have walls and gates. You can control the gate of a walled city, you control what goes in and out. So basically you control that city.
Yes.
Why did they, if they got peace around them, why do they always got a gate, a wall and a gate?
Well, when you say if they have peace around them, remember there's lots of Ishmael and his descendants were to be warriors and everything, and they were all constantly warring against the Israelites.
But
and
if
so
your country's as big as the state of Oklahoma, your city's in the middle of it like Oklahoma City is. Why would you need a wall and a gate around a city in the middle with that much land around you?
Keep the animals
of your people.
Keep the animals.
A fence would keep it out. You don't need a wall.
I don't know, John. I just know that the scriptures say that each city had a wall.
Everywhere you see a city, it had a wall and a gate.
Yeah.
I was just curious why.
I would think
And when did they do away with the gates and the walls?
Very handy when the enemy comes up against you.
All right, our time is just about up. Now I want to read the last part of it here. Let's read verses 20 through 24. Karen, read that for me, please.
Okay. 23 through and 24?
20 through 24.
Oh, 20. Oh, okay. And it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she also hath borne children unto thy brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Chesed, and
Hazor,
and Pildash, and Zidlah, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begat Rebekah. These 8 did Milcah bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she also bare Tebah, and Gaham, and Tahash, and Maacah.
All right. Now it kind of seems like this last few verses are kind of out of place from everything we've looked at in chapter 22, but this short history seems to introduce solely for the purpose of preparing the reader for the transactions that we're going to see in chapter 24, verses 1 through 67, which we won't look there at this point, but to show that the providence of God was preparing in one of the branches of the family of Abraham a suitable spouse for his son Isaac, and we're going to get to that to look for the spouse for Isaac. But remember what I told you when I show you these slides, the ancestor of Jesus is always in red. So you have Micah, Nahor's wife, you had Nahor, Abraham's brother, and the two of them brought about Kemuel, and of Kemuel, all of these sons, but you have Bethuel, and then from there you have Rebekah and Laban. This is where we're going to pick up Isaac here. Remember, Laban has 2 daughters, and Isaac goes because Abraham sends Isaac back to his kin to get a wife. And he ends up getting 2, Leah and who? Rachel. So that's where we are with this right here. All right. Any? Yes, John.
Does it say he was the father of Abraham?
Says who was the father of Abraham?
The
No, he's a brother.
Brother.
no.
It says Abraham's brother.
In verse 21, it says Huz his firstborn, Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Abraham.
Yeah.
Then it goes on to the other brothers. Why did they throw Abraham in
Right here is Abraham.
there? Yeah.
But all they're doing is giving a lineage here. I don't know why God chose to put Abraham in here. There's no further, other than the fact that when you look at Camille, these were the 2, 4, 6 sons.
No.
What was his?
No.
Okay? Correct me.
Okay, it says in 23, these 8 Malachi bare to Nahor, Abraham's brother. All of them is Nahor's sons, not Kemuel's. The only ones that's his is Bethuel and Rebekah and Laban. All them others are Abraham's brother's kids. Aham and whatever you said, Hazar.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Them are all Nahor's kids.
These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor. 2, 4, 6.
Only one out of Nahor.
Only one out of that group,
Kemuel,
well, 2. The one that bare Abraham, that's Nahor's grandson, and then the one that begat Rebekah, that's Nahor, that's his grandson, or Rebekah's his grandson.
Okay.
So you got them all misplaced.
No, I
The
haven't.
chart's wrong.
I'll go back and look at the chart, and we'll make sure we have it correct next
Don't go
week.
look at the chart. Look at the scripture and see what it says compared to your chart.
I'll go back and look at the chart, and we'll have it correct next week. I'm not going to change the chart, but I'll say what's correct.
You might ought to change the chart if it's wrong.
No, because I'm not going to send down a whole bunch more charts just to correct that one chart.
You mean you got all the rest of your charts is wrong, so every chart you got from now on is going to be wrong? Because that was
No, just this one chart,
You
John.
only need to change one. You don't need to change the rest of them.
But I'd have to download them all. I can't just change one without re-downloading the whole bunch.
That's computer for you.